And welcome to the Word Encounter, episode 58. Yesterday we concluded in 2 Samuel chapter 6, so let's pick up in chapter 7. We see that in chapter 7, David has returned from his exploits, and he's in his house, chilling out, basically relaxing. And in verse 2 it says, the king said to the prophet Nathan, he's having a conversation with his prophet, he says, look, I am living in a cedar house while the ark of God sits inside of tent curtains. And so this is an egregious imbalance from David's perspective. He's feeling as though he's not honoring the Lord. How can I live here and the Lord lives in a tent? Verse 4, but that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go to my servant David and say, this is what the Lord says. Are you to build me a house to dwell in? And so Nathan is to go to David and ask him this question, are you to build me a house to dwell in? And then the Lord goes and tells Nathan all the things that he's done. He's wandered around the wilderness with the Israelites, and he's been going before them. He says, have I ever asked for anybody to build me a house? Why does David think this and whatnot? He says, and then I want you to go there. And he says in verse 6, or verse 8, it says, so now this is what you are to say to my servant David. And he says, look, if we drop down further in verse 11, the Lord declares to you, the Lord himself will make a house for you. No, you're not to make me a house, David. I'm going to make you a house. Verse 12, when your time comes and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up after you your descendant who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. Verse 13, he is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he goes wrong, I will discipline him with the rod of men and blows from mortals. But my faithful love will never leave him, as it did when I removed it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Verse 16, your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. And so he says, no, David, I'm going to build you a house. This is what's going to happen in your lineage. This is going to happen with your legacy. I'm going to raise a son that you have, and he's going to build a house for my name. And so in verse 18, then King David went in, sat in the Lord's presence and said, who am I, Lord God, and what is my house that you have brought me this far? He says, who am I, God? And who am I that you have brought me this far, me and my house this far? And so David he's displaying his sincere humility right here, saying, who am I? You brought me and now you're telling me all these wondrous things that are going to happen after I'm gathered to you. And so it's overwhelming to him. And so he goes on and he prays this prayer of thanksgiving. I highly recommend that you read it, and so this is chapter 7, verse 19 through the end of chapter 7. He's just giving this beautiful prayer of thanksgiving to the Lord. And the most important part is it's 100% sincere. And so let's move on to chapter 8. And it says, after this, David defeated the Philistines. And then he defeated the Moabites, and then he defeated Zobah, and then he defeated the Arameans. And so chapter 8, goes into reveal all of David's battlefield conquests and how successful he was at warfare. In verse 13, it says, David made a reputation for himself when he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in Salt Valley. And so we see that, David, his reputation was just growing and growing and growing and growing as a fierce warrior, strategist, a battlefield genius and whatnot, not only amongst the Israelites, but amongst all the peoples in the region, all the kingdoms in the region. In verse 15, it says, so David reigned over all Israel, administering justice and righteousness for all his people. So we can see why the Lord has called him a man after his own heart, because justice and righteousness was of supreme importance to David, probably only secondary to following the Lord. And so, but he's also a man, and we'll see that men have failings. Go on to chapter 9. And in verse 1, it says, David asked, is there anyone remaining from the family of Saul I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake? Now remember, Jonathan and David had made a covenant, a vow, in which David, at the time, Jonathan, I guess, was thinking he was going to survive the wars and that he would be David's second man after David ascended to the throne. But also a part of that covenant was that he would make sure to take over and watch over Jonathan's house, and that no bad thing, no destruction would come to Jonathan's house. And so David is intent on following through with his vow, even though Jonathan was dead. And so so he's asking in verse 2, or he's asking, is there anybody I can show kindness to? In verse 2, there was a servant of Saul's family named Ziba. And so Ziba comes before David and says, yes, there is one. There's Mephibosheth, who is Jonathan's son. And I am watching over him, but he's injured in both feet. And so he's lame. He can't walk. And so David asks, where is he? And Ziba tells him where he is. And he says, well, bring him to me. And so in verse 6, it says, Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, fell face down, and paid homage to David. David said, Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth said, I am your servant, he replied. Verse 7, don't be afraid, David said to him, since I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all your grandfather Saul's fields, and you will always eat meals at my table. And so David is telling Mephibosheth, I'm going to make you whole. Everything that was Saul's is now going to be yours, and you're going to eat at my table. And so Mephibosheth's response was similar to David's when David was speaking before the Lord, and it was like, who am I? Why do I deserve this? And, David essentially tells him, because it's a covenant I made with your father. It's essentially what the answer is. And it says, so Mephibosheth ate at David's table, just like one of the king's sons. And so David followed through, on his covenant, on his vow. He followed through. It didn't matter that Jonathan was dead. He followed through, and now he's taking care of his son. In chapter 10, that kind of highlights Joab and Abishai, his brother. And now you remember that David kind of cursed Commander Joab because they had killed Abner. And he was in process of negotiating, taking over all of Israel. And so he kind of cursed Joab and his family. But Joab is still under his command. And Joab was a brilliant military man. And he, like David, would have conquest after conquest after conquest in the field. And so he was still in the employ of the Israeli army, okay, even though David had kind of cursed him. And so we move on to chapter 11, and now things get really interesting. And so it says in verse 1, in the spring when kings march out to war, David sent Joab with his officials and all Israel. Now the word makes specific note when kings go out to war, because it says, but David remained in Jerusalem. And so David sent his warriors out, but he remained there. And that ends up getting him in big, big trouble. Verse 2, one evening David got up from his bed and strolled around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. So David sent someone to inquire about her, and he said, isn't this Bathsheba, son of Eliam, the wife of Uriah, the Hittite? In verse 4, David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to him, he slept with her. So he knew that she was married, and he came because I guess she was beautiful and he was in the mood, and he slept with her. And but there was a problem. She returned home, and then it says in verse 5, the woman conceived and sent word to inform David, I am pregnant. Verse 6, David sent orders to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent Uriah to David. So they were out fighting, and so David sends word, send this soldier back to me. So he sends him back to him. Uriah comes back, and in verse 8, then he said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the palace with all his master's servants. He did not go to his house. So David was planning on Uriah to go home, have a good time, sleep with his wife and whatnot, to cover up the fact that she was pregnant. Verse 10, when it was reported to David, Uriah didn't go home. David questioned Uriah, haven't you just come from the journey? Why didn't you go home? Verse 11, Uriah said to David, the ark Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my master Joab and his soldiers are camping in the open field. How can I enter my house and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As surely as you live and by your life, I will not do this. So Uriah is a man of principle and honor. He's saying, look, my boys are out there fighting in the fields. They're sleeping on the ground and whatnot. They're eating God knows what, and I'm going to go home and have a nice dinner and sleep with my wife. And no. This shall never be. And so we see that Uriah here and his principles are awesome. And so then David tells him, okay, stay here, and tomorrow I'll send you back. In verse 13, then David invited Uriah to eat and drink with him, and David got him drunk. So David is still trying. He went out in the evening to lie down on his cot in his master's servants, but he did not go home. So again, we see David got him drunk, got him inebriated, tried to get his thinking foggy, and so then he'll go home and sleep with his wife. He didn't do it. In verse 14, the next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In the letter he wrote, put Uriah at the front of the fiercest fighting, then withdraw from him so that he gets struck down and dies. This is treacherous, And so that's exactly what happens. And so they were fighting in verse 17. Then the men of the city came out to attack Joab, and some of the men from David's soldiers fell in battle. Uriah the Hittite also died. And so Uriah wasn't the only one that died. Some other guys died with him to cover up David's sin. So David essentially murdered these people to cover up his sin. So Joab sends word back to David that this has been accomplished. And so in verse 26, it says, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah had died, she mourned for him. When the time of mourning ended, David had her brought to his house. She became his wife and bore him a son. So she mourned for him, and then she gets up and goes and marries David. Okay. But the last sentence is critical. However, the Lord considered what David had done to be evil. Heck yeah, it was evil. Are you going to kill a man and take his wife? So anyway, the Lord sends Nathan to David. And Nathan tells him this story with regard to lambs and sheep, and a rich man takes a poor man's lambs, and then he needs to, give up one of them. So he prepares one of the poor man's lambs and not one of his. So David gets outraged. And in verse 5, it says, David was infuriated with the man and said to Nathan, as long as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die, because he has done this thing and shown no pity. He must pay 4 lambs for that lamb. So David gets indignant at this injustice, because remember, righteous injusticeness is very important to David most of the time. In verse 7, Nathan replied to David, you are that man. That parable, the story I gave you, that was just a story. You are that man I'm talking about. This is what the Lord of Israel says. I appointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. And I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that was not enough, I would have given you even more. Why have you despised the Lord's command by doing what I consider evil? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife as your own. You murdered him with the Ammonite sword. Therefore, the sword will never leave your house. In other words, you introduce violence into this situation, and so violence is never going to leave your house. In verse 11, this is what the Lord says. I'm going to bring disaster on you from your own family. I will take your wives and give them to another before your very eyes, and he will sleep with them in broad daylight. You acted in secret, but I will do this before all Israel and in broad daylight. What gets done in the dark comes out in the light. In verse 13, David responded to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Then Nathan replied to David, and the Lord has taken away your sin. You will not die. Now, notice David's response. Unlike Saul, remember when Saul was caught with his hand in the cookie jar, Saul made every kind of excuse as to why he did this or why he was trying to please the Lord or why this was honoring to the Lord, this and another. David just fessed up. He just said, I have sinned before the Lord. You're right. I did it. Verse 14. Well, back to 13, it says, okay, you will not die. However, because you treated the Lord with such contempt in this matter, the son born to you will die. And Nathan went home. The Lord struck the baby that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became deathly ill. Verse 16, David pleaded with God for the boy. He fasted, went home, and spent the night lying on the ground. The elders of his house stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat anything with them. Verse 18, on the seventh day, the baby died. So then David gets up. He asks, well, he doesn't know yet. He sees his servants milling around talking. So he asks them, is the baby dead? And they say, yes, the baby's dead. In verse 20, then David got up from the ground. He washed, anointed himself, changed his clothes, went to the Lord's house and worshiped. So the Lord had just told him he was going to strike his son down or his baby down and because of what he did, and he did. And so David prayed and fasted. It didn't do any good. They told him the baby died. So he gets up, and what's the first thing he does? He goes to worship the Lord. Wow. Then he went home and requested something to eat, so they served him food, and he ate. In verse 21, his servants asked him, why have you done this? While the baby was alive, you fasted and wept, but when he died, you got up and ate food. So they were kind of confused. And so in verse 22, David answered, while the baby was alive, I fasted and wept because I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let him live. Verse 23, but now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I'll go to him, but he'll never return to me. So David's saying, I'll go to him. I'll die and join him, but he'll never return to me. So that's why I got up and quit fasting, because the game was up. In verse 24, then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. He went to her and slept with her. She gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and he sent a message through the prophet Nathan, who named him Jedediah, because of the Lord. And so we see where Solomon comes from, right? All of this nonsense. But anyway,